The dog stopped first. That was always how it began between them. Rex reading the world a half second ahead of Cade, the dog's body translating information that hadn't yet reached human perception into something immediate and physical. A stiffening of the haunches, ears pivoting forward like antennae finding a frequency, the subtle shift of weight from casual movement to coiled attention that Cade had come to recognize as reliably as he recognized his own heartbeat, as reliably as he recognized the feeling of Montana air in his lungs on a cold October morning. Cade Merritt had learned over 6 years of working and living alongside this animal to treat that shift as signal, not noise, not the dog being a dog in the morning chasing scent trails and following impulses in the way that dogs without training sometimes did. Signal, the kind that in the years when signals mattered in ways that were immediate and mortal had saved his life more than once, and that he had stopped questioning even after the context in which it had first become meaningful had dissolved into the civilian quiet of a Montana cabin and morning trails through ponderosa pines and the particular stillness of a life that had been deliberately simplified to its essentials. He had been trying to simplify it for 3 years. The cabin had been part of that effort. The trails had been part of it. The routine of the morning walks, the same route most days, the familiar arc of the trail that wound up toward the ridge and back through the lower meadow had been part of it. Routine as therapy, repetition as medicine, the body doing the same things in the same order until the mind deprived of novelty had less to react to. It worked more or less. The nights were still difficult sometimes, the way nights had been difficult since his discharge. The particular darkness that came not from the room, but from the inside, from the accumulated weight of years of operational experience that the mind did not know how to file and could not stop processing. But the mornings helped, Rex helped, the specific quality of attention that the dog brought to these walks, the way he engaged with the forest and the trail and the changing morning light, as though every element of it was worth knowing about, had a way of pulling Cade into the present tense and keeping him there for the duration of the walk. He stopped walking and watched Rex. They were 3 miles into their morning route, the trail that wound through the ponderosa pines behind the cabin and climbed toward the ridge before looping back through the lower meadow. It was the kind of October morning that Montana does better than anywhere else on the continent. Cold enough to see your breath in small clouds that dissipated immediately into the clear air, the light coming in at that low autumn angle that found the amber in every surface and made the ordinary world look like something deliberate, something arranged for effect. The maples had gone gold and the larches were turning, and the sky above the ridge was the particular pale blue of October at altitude clear and precise and giving nothing away. Cade had been counting his steps the way he always did on these walks, not because he was aware of doing it, but because his body had long since taken over the management of anxiety without consulting his conscious mind. Counting breathing, moving forward. The three things that kept the day from collapsing inward on itself before it had a chance to properly begin. He had been doing this for 3 years, and it still helped. He suspected it would help for the rest of his life, and he had made a kind of peace with that, with the idea that some adjustments became permanent, and that permanent did not necessarily mean bad. Rex was not moving. The dog stood in the middle of the trail with his body angled slightly toward the tree line to the east, his nose working in that concentrated, methodical way that meant he had found something with a scent profile worth investigating at full capacity. 9 years old, and his nose was still as precise as it had been at 3. Some things in a well-built animal don't deteriorate with age. They concentrate the way good whiskey concentrates when it ages the excess burned off over time until what remains is the essential quality at its maximum expression. Cade did not call Rex back to the trail. He had learned years ago that calling Rex back from this kind of attention was not only futile but wasteful. The dog was doing work. The right response was to let him do it and pay attention to what he found. That had been the principle of their working relationship from the beginning, each reading the other's signals, each trusting the other's assessment of what required response and what did not. It had made them effective together in environments that required effectiveness, and it had carried into the civilian mornings as naturally as breathing. He watched. Rex took 3 steps toward the tree line, deliberate steps, not the bounding exploration of an animal following a casual interest, but the measured forward movement of a dog who knows exactly where he is going and is proceeding with intention rather than impulse. Then he stopped and looked back at Cade over his shoulder, the specific look that Cade had come to understand as the dog's clearest form of communication, the look that said, "I have found something and I need you to come and see it, and I will wait here for as long as it takes you to decide to follow." In a different dog, in a different moment, this might have read as simple curiosity. A squirrel's trail preserved in the morning duff, the old scent of a deer crossing from the night before. These things happened on morning walks, and Rex pursued them sometimes with the engaged interest of an animal who finds the world endlessly worth investigating. But Cade had spent enough mornings on this trail to know its rhythms and the things that move through it, and he had spent enough years with Rex to know the difference between Rex following interest and Rex following something that required Cade's active participation, something that Rex had decided mattered in a way that went beyond the dog's private experience of the morning. What he was seeing now was the latter. Cade left the trail and followed. The ground here was soft with the accumulated depth of years of pine needles and the organic matter that undisturbed forest floor develops over decades, and it gave under his boots with the slight spring of earth that has not been compacted by regular traffic. The trees thinned as he moved east, the trail falling away behind him, the ridge visible through the canopy above as a line of gray granite against the pale morning sky. He had walked this property in every direction multiple times over the 3 years he had owned it. He had mapped it mentally the way he mapped everything that mattered to him in detail, with attention to variations in terrain and drainage and the particular qualities of different sections. He knew its features and its boundaries, the way you come to know terrain that you cross and recheck and cross again until the map of it lives in your body rather than requiring conscious reference. There was nothing in this direction worth noting. He had walked here a dozen times and found nothing that distinguished this section of ridge from any other section of ridge, which was to say it was granite and pine and the occasional hawk overhead and the sound of the wind in the trees and the smell of the forest floor disturbed by his footsteps. Beautiful in the way that this entire place was beautiful and entirely without anything that warranted special attention. He had been certain of that. He was not the first time he had been certain of something and been wrong. Rex stopped at the base of a rock face that formed the lower edge of the ridge, an expanse of gray granite, perhaps 30 feet high, its surface thick with the dark green of moss that had been establishing itself here for decades, and the hanging curtain of vine that grew in the shelter of the overhang above a specific species that preferred exactly these conditions of filtered light and protected moisture. Cade had walked past this formation dozens of times over 3 years. He had noted it as a geological feature, the kind of ridge outcropping common to this part of Montana, and had moved on each time without lingering. Rex was not moving on. The dog pressed his nose to the rock face at a specific point, low and to the left of center, where the vines grew thickest and most densely, where the curtain of growth was unbroken by any gap or variation, and he began to scratch. Not the scratching of an animal pursuing something burrowed into the earth beneath the rock. The focused, deliberate scratching of a dog who has been trained to indicate a specific thing, and is indicating it a dog working a problem with the systematic intensity that good training at its best produces and that years of maintenance keep sharp. Cade felt something shift in his chest, not fear. He had worked hard in the years since his discharge to recalibrate his relationship with the physical sensation of threat, to learn the difference between the body's alarm system functioning correctly in response to genuine information and the body's alarm system misfiring. Because the context had changed, but the wiring had not been updated to reflect the change. He had worked on this with the VA therapist and on his own in the quiet of the cabin, and he had made progress, real, measurable progress, the kind that shows up not in the absence of the sensation, but in the ability to assess it accurately rather than simply reacting to it. What he felt now was not the misfiring kind. It was the other kind, the kind that in the years when it had mattered had been reliable enough to stake his life on. He moved to the vine-covered section of rock and took hold of the nearest tendril and pulled. The vine came away in sections old growth that had been rooting here for many years, its grip on the rock substantial but not permanent. Cade pulled steadily and systematically, working from one edge toward the other, not tearing at the growth impatiently, but removing it methodically, the way you removed anything that needed to be removed, without damaging what was beneath it. He pulled and cleared and pulled again, and what emerged behind the falling curtain of vine was not rock. It was steel, a door, set flush into the rock face with a precision that spoke of deliberate engineering rather than improvisation, its edges sealed against the granite, with a craftsmanship that had kept this entrance invisible under decades of encroaching vegetation. The surface was dark with rust at the hinges, and along the lower edge where moisture would have collected and worked its patient chemistry over years, but the structure itself was intact. The handle was a military-style lever, the specific configuration that Cade recognized from classified facilities he had entered and exited in the course of work he had done in places that did not appear on any public map. He stood back and looked at it for a long moment. Rex sat at his feet and looked at it too, with the composed attention of an animal that has arrived at the destination it was navigating toward and is now waiting patiently for the next phase of whatever this is to begin. The door was not random. Everything about its construction communicated intentional concealment, the work of people who had needed this access point to exist without being discovered by anyone who might walk through this particular stretch of Montana forest. The steel grade was not civilian hardware store stock. The flush fit against the granite was precise to a degree that required expertise and equipment. The military pattern handle was the kind used in installations built to specific specifications rather than general purpose. The quality of the seal against the rock, which it held for what must have been decades given the growth covering it, spoke of an installation built by people who expected it to last and had used the materials and the methods to ensure that it did. Cade had spent 15 years in service that required clearances he still technically held, working in places and with programs whose existence was maintained at levels of classification that made ordinary secrecy seem casual by comparison. He knew that such installations existed scattered through remote areas of the American interior, built during periods of specific anxiety and maintained or abandoned according to the shifting priorities of the programs that had created them. He had simply never expected to find one a quarter mile from where he kept his coffee maker in the rock face of a ridge he had walked past without seeing for 3 years. He reached for the handle. The mechanism resisted in the way of things that have not moved in a long time, the rust in the hinges and around the bolt, creating friction that required sustained pressure rather than force. Cade applied pressure in the steady, measured way he applied pressure to anything he needed to open without breaking feeling for the point at which the mechanism would yield rather than the point at which it would give way permanently. The distinction mattered. Breaking things that you subsequently needed to use was a failure of patience, and patience was the quality that had gotten him through more difficult situations than force had. Patience over power, understanding what you were working with before you decided how to work with it. The door gave with a sound that was part groan and part release, something between a long protest and an exhalation, the sound of a mechanism that had been held closed for a very long time finally opening because someone with the right approach had asked it to. A wash of cold air came through the opening, carrying the smell of concrete and damp stone, and the particular staleness of enclosed space that has been sealed away from the movement of seasons and the cycling of outside air for more years than Cade could estimate from the smell alone. He unclipped the small flashlight he kept on his pack on these morning walks. In 3 years of living at the cabin, he had never once left the property without it. Some habits formed in the years when they mattered directly and immediately continued to serve in the years after through different mechanisms, and this was one he had no interest in reconsidering. The beam found a concrete tunnel, sloping downward at a gentle grade into the rock. Its walls smooth and marked only by the pale mineral traces that moisture, moving slowly through the mountain above, had left along the lower sections over the decades. Fluorescent fixtures ran along the ceiling at intervals, their tubes long since dark, but their casings still intact. Emergency lighting panels at floor level emitted a dim greenish glow from battery backups that had somehow retained enough charge to function after years of sealed darkness, casting the corridor in a quality of light that made it look like something underwater, preserved and still and waiting. Rex moved past him into the tunnel without hesitation. Cade noted this carefully. Rex entering a confined space ahead of him was not unusual, and had precedent in their working history his nose providing information in those environments that human senses could not gather at the necessary speed or with the necessary resolution. But what Cade was noting was not the fact of Rex going first. It was the quality of the dog's movement. There was no tension in him, no raised hackles along the spine, no the careful edged alertness that the dog showed when entering a space that might contain something that required his protective attention, the particular quality of readiness that Cade could read in the set of the dog's shoulders and the angle of his ears. Rex moved through this tunnel with the ease and confidence of an animal, in familiar territory, the movement of a dog who has been in this corridor before and knows what it contains and what it does not, which was impossible, because Cade had been walking these trails for 3 years and had never found this entrance, which meant Rex had never found it either, because Rex was with him every morning on every trail, and had been since they arrived in Montana 3 years ago, unless Rex had been here before they came to Montana, unless Rex had been here before they were ever paired together, unless there was something about Rex's history that Cade did not know, something that explained why the dog moved through a classified underground facility in Gallatin County with the ease of an animal returning to familiar ground. Cade filed that thought in the category of things that required explanation and followed the dog into the tunnel. The slope continued for roughly 60 yards before leveling out and opening into a chamber with sufficient ceiling height to stand in fully and enough floor space to move around with ease. Cade's flashlight swept the space in the systematic pattern he used in any new environment, left to right and high to low, the trained assessment of someone who has learned to understand the layout and contents of a room quickly and under conditions that do not favor leisurely examination. Metal shelving units lined the walls, their surfaces carrying the organized evidence of a facility that had been functional and has now been stilled. Equipment cases stacked in ordered rows, their latches showing the specific surface oxidation that came from years of ambient moisture rather than use. File boxes labeled with a numbering system Cade did not immediately recognize. A workstation along the far wall, its surface clear except for the settled layer of dust that accumulated in sealed spaces over years, its chair pushed in with the careful tidiness of someone who had left expecting to return and had not returned. On the wall above the workstation, partially obscured by the grime of years, without cleaning, a logo that Cade's flashlight found in pieces, before his mind assembled it into a coherent whole. A circular emblem, a shield at its center, lettering around the circumference that resolved as he crossed toward it. He crossed to the workstation. The logo resolved fully as he approached. The shield was standard Department of Defense imagery, the kind that appeared on 1,000 pieces of official documentation and dozens of installation walls in the system he had spent 15 years operating within. The lettering read Project Warden, Behavioral Research Division. Cade had 15 years of operational experience in classified environments that ranged across multiple agencies and command structures and levels of classification. He had worked with units and programs whose designations were meaningless to the public and whose existence was maintained at classification levels that made ordinary secrecy seem casual by comparison. He had been briefed on programs that did not appear in any public record and had worked alongside operations that would not be acknowledged for decades, if ever. In all of that time and all of the briefings and documents and facilities and personnel he had encountered in the course of that service, he had never heard the designation Project Warden. On the workstation surface, partially cleared of dust, in a way that suggested recent disturbance rather than long undisturbed settling, was a file folder. Not the institutional gray of the other file boxes arranged on the shelves. A standard manila folder, its edges worn with handling but its structure still intact. A piece of white label tape across the front bore a typed designation that Cade read from a distance before he picked it up, reading it twice to be certain of what he was seeing. Merritt Cade A, Subject 7, Project Warden, his name, typed on a label, on a folder in a facility he had found 20 minutes ago, in a room he had not known existed until this morning, in a tunnel hidden behind a steel door in the rock face of a ridge he had walked past without seeing for 3 years. He stood very still. Rex sat at his feet. The dog looked up at him with patient amber eyes, then looked at the folder, then looked back at Cade with the attentiveness of an animal, waiting for the human to process what the animal has already understood and move on to the next phase of what needs to happen. Cade opened the folder. The first document was a summary sheet of the kind used in classified behavioral research programs to provide quick reference to subject history. The formatting was government standard, identical to dozens of similar documents he had seen in his operational years. The font was government standard. The identification numbers in the header were government standard and precise in the way of numbers generated by institutional systems rather than typed by individual hands. Everything about the document was bureaucratically ordinary and entirely routine except for the identity of its subject. His name. His date of birth correct to the day. His place of birth, a hospital in Casper, Wyoming that no longer operated under that name. His social security number, his father's full name, the name of a man who had died of a heart attack when Cade was 22, and whom he had not thought about in this specific context in a long time. His mother's full name, the name of a woman who had remarried and moved to Arizona, and with whom he maintained contact at the level of quarterly phone calls that were warm but brief. The town in central Wyoming where he had grown up, a town so small it barely rated a pin on most maps of the state, a town whose name he had not spoken aloud in months. All of it correct. All of it present in a file that had been sitting in this room sealed inside this mountain for years, without his knowledge and without his consent. The second document was a timeline. Cade read it, standing at the workstation, his flashlight supplemented by the dim greenish glow of the emergency lighting panels along the floor And what the timeline described was a surveillance operation that had begun when he was 19 years old, not when he was a SEAL, not when he was in training, not when he was in any branch of the military or any structure of authority that could claim any legitimate jurisdiction over the movements of his life. When he was 19 years old, working a summer job at a grain elevator in a small Wyoming town, before he had decided what direction to point himself in, before the most classified thing he had encountered in his life was the combination to the equipment shed at his high school baseball field. Someone had begun watching him then, a project with a government designation, and apparently the resources and the operational capacity to conduct sustained surveillance of a 19-year-old in a town of fewer than 800 people in a summer that had been entirely ordinary by every measure available to him at the time. A project that had tracked his movements and his decisions and his psychological responses through his eventual enlistment and his training progression and his selection for SEAL qualification and his years of operational deployment and his return from those deployments and his discharge and the 2 years that had followed the discharge. A project that had files on him he had never known existed and had never consented to participate in and had never been given the opportunity to refuse. He turned to the photographs. There were 12 of them printed on standard photo paper and attached to a divider in the folder with a single paper clip. Each photograph carried a date written in the lower right corner in a consistent hand. The earliest photograph was from the summer he was 19. He was standing outside the grain elevator in work clothes, a plain t-shirt and jeans, squinting against the late afternoon sun. His expression carrying the particular unguarded blankness of a young man who is not performing for anyone because he has no idea that anyone is there to perform for. He did not remember this moment. He had no reason to. It was an ordinary moment in an ordinary summer, indistinguishable in his memory from every other afternoon he had spent in that town, in that heat, doing work that paid adequately and thinking about what he was going to do with himself when the summer ended. There were thousands of such moments from that period, and he did not remember them individually. He remembered the summer as a whole, the quality of it, the particular feeling of that time before he knew what direction his life would take, but not its specific instance. But someone had been there in that specific instance, someone physically present in a town of 800 people, close enough to produce a photograph in which his face was clearly readable and his expression was visible in the specific way that meant the photographer had not been at a great distance without him ever having any indication that he was being observed. He looked at each of the 12 photographs in sequence. The dates spanned 15 years. He was recognizable in all of them at various ages, in various contexts, in various locations. Some he recognized, some he did not. In several he was in uniform, in several he was in civilian clothes. In one he was at what appeared to be a bar in a city he had been deployed near. In a photograph taken through a window from outside at night, the interior light making him visible while the photographer remained in the dark. The most recent photograph was dated 3 years ago. He was on this trail, the trail he had just left to follow Rex toward the rock face. He was in civilian clothes, the same pack he wore now on his back. Rex walking at his heel in the patient way Rex walked when they were covering ground rather than investigating something. The angle was from above and to the right, from somewhere on the lower edge of the ridge, from the vicinity of the door he had opened 40 minutes ago. Someone had been standing in the vicinity of this facility 3 years ago, watching him walk his dog on his own property on a private morning, and he had walked past that someone and never known. He set the photographs down and turned to the technical section of the folder. These documents were denser, written in the specific vocabulary of behavioral research programs, the kind of vocabulary that combined scientific precision with bureaucratic formality in the particular way that government-funded research tended to produce. Cade worked through them the way he had worked through intelligence briefings in the years when understanding complex documents quickly had been a professional requirement, not reading every word in linear sequence, but extracting the structural logic first and filling in the specifics as they became relevant to the shape that was forming. The shape that formed was this. Project Warden had identified through a proprietary screening process that operated in coordination with selective service records and educational assessments and medical databases and a range of other sources that the documents referenced obliquely a population of individuals who demonstrated what the documents called anomalous resilience profiles. The resilience in question was not primarily physical, though physical metrics were included in the comprehensive assessment battery. It was psychological. The specific capacity to experience extreme and sustained stress and operational trauma and to recover full functional capacity faster than the statistical norm to continue operating under conditions that would produce lasting incapacitation in the broader population, and to sustain that recovery over years of continued exposure rather than experiencing the cumulative degradation that characterized the more typical trajectory. The project had monitored these individuals without their knowledge or consent over an extended period, tracking their behavioral patterns and their relationship formations and their decision-making under various categories of stress and their long-term psychological trajectories following exposure to operational trauma. The monitoring had been conducted under the authority of a classified program within the Department of Defense. Its legal framework derived from executive orders that did not appear in the public record. Subject 7 appeared throughout the documents more frequently than any other subject designation in the cohort. Subject 7 had been assessed as the most significant profile in the entire program, the individual whose resilience metrics most consistently and most substantially exceeded the parameters that had been established as defining the extraordinary category. Subject 7 had been tracked for 15 years before the program formally initiated what the documents described as active engagement through the deployment pairing protocol. His deployment pairing. Cade stopped on that phrase and read the section it belonged to a second time, carefully making sure he understood the full meaning of what the words were saying before he allowed himself to react to them. The pairing of Subject 7 with K9 Unit Designation 07, operational name Rex, had been engineered in the planning phase of Subject 7's final deployment cycle. K907 had been in development for 14 months prior to the pairing. The first 4 months of that training had taken place at this facility in this location in the hills of Gallatin County, Montana. The remaining 10 months had taken place at a separate installation whose name was not referenced in this document. The training protocol across both phases had been specifically calibrated not to the general behavioral profile of a high-performance SEAL operator, but to the specific individually documented behavioral profile of one particular man, a profile built from 15 years of direct observation and behavioral data. Rex had not been assigned to him. Rex had been built for him. Cade set the folder down on the workstation surface and put both hands flat on the desk and stood for a long moment looking at the wall in front of him, at the Project Warden logo, at the faded shield and the lettering around it, and the grime of years that had been accumulating on this wall while he was living his life without knowing this room existed, at the evidence of years of classified activity conducted in this chamber, beneath this mountain, in this forest he had been walking through for 3 years, without knowing any of it was here. Rex pressed his head against Cade's thigh. The dog's warmth was real. The pressure of his skull against Cade's leg was real and immediate and present. 6 years of mornings on trails that were first operational and then merely civilian, of nights on the floor of every place Cade had lived since his discharge, because Rex preferred floors to dog beds, and Cade had stopped providing dog beds after the second one went unused. 6 years of being present in the specific way that Rex was present, which was different in quality from the way any other living thing Cade had encountered was present, different in the particular attentiveness of it, and the consistency of it, and the lack of any apparent agenda beyond being there. The nights when the memories came through with the force they sometimes came through with the specific force of things that do not diminish with repetition. And Rex would be there in the dark, not moving, not making sound, just being there as a physical fact, a warm weight against his side, an anchor to the present tense, real, whatever the origin of it, whatever the engineering that had preceded it and created the capacity for it. The reality of what it had become across 6 years was real in the way that only things tested by time and sustained through it are real. Cade reached down and put his hand on Rex's head. He stayed there for a moment, hand on the dog's head, not thinking about the folder or what was in it or what it meant, just being in the moment that was actually happening, which was him and Rex in a cold underground room in Montana in October, which was strange and would take time to understand, but which was also simply the next moment in a series of moments that had begun 6 years ago when a German shepherd had appeared in his operational unit and looked at him with amber eyes as if they were already familiar with each other. He took his hand from Rex's head and turned back to the folder. He needed to understand the full shape of what he was holding before he decided what to do with it. He was a man who had spent 15 years in operational environments where acting on partial understanding was the surest route to outcomes you could not predict and could not undo. He would read everything. He would understand everything fully. Then he would act. He turned to the final section of the folder. This section was shorter than the others. 3 documents. The first 2 were internal memos referencing program status updates and administrative matters, their language, the familiar bureaucratic density of institutional correspondence. He read them quickly, extracting the essential elements and adding them to the shape that was forming in his understanding. The third document was a single page, and the paper it was printed on was noticeably less degraded than the others, less yellowed, its fiber less compromised by the ambient moisture that had worked on everything else in this room over the years. This document had been added significantly more recently than the others. The date at the top confirmed it exactly 2 years ago. It was not a memo. It was not a research summary or an administrative update. It was a direct operational notation, 4 sentences, and the 4th sentence was the kind that changed the fundamental terms of the situation you believed yourself to be in. Subject 7 has been located and confirmed in Gallatin County, Montana. Psychological profile remains consistent with original assessment parameters. Extended surveillance has been established at current residence and surrounding terrain. If subject locates this facility, contingency protocol is active. Do not engage without explicit authorization. Cade read it twice. Then he looked around the chamber in a different way than he had been looking at it, not as someone reading the residue of an abandoned project, but as an operator reading the geometry of a space that might still be in active use by people who had an operational interest in his behavior. Rex stood up, both ears forward fully extended and aimed. Not the posture of alarm, not the raised hackle readiness that preceded an aggressive response. The posture of recognition, the posture of an animal receiving information he was expecting to receive. From the tunnel, from somewhere in the corridor he had walked down 12 minutes ago, came a sound. Footsteps, measured and unhurried and making no attempt at quiet. Cade did not move toward the tunnel. He moved laterally to the right side of the chamber entrance, putting the wall at his back and the full width of the room in his field of view simultaneously. It was not a conscious decision in the sense of being deliberated. It was what his body did when a space it occupied was about to be entered by an unknown presence 15 years of this having compressed the distance between perception and response until the response operated at a level below conscious direction, a loop that ran on its own power and did not wait for the reasoning mind to catch up. Rex did not follow him to the wall. Rex stood in the center of the chamber facing the tunnel entrance, his tail moving in the slow, deliberate rhythm that Cade had learned to distinguish from other patterns of tail movement. Not the fast wag of excitement or play, not the low, stiff wag that indicated unease or warning. This was the specific rhythm that Cade had come to read as recognition, the movement of an animal greeting, something it knew from a prior context. The footsteps were unhurried and made no attempt at quiet, which was itself information. People who intended harm in enclosed spaces with a single entry point did not announce themselves with a normal walking pace. They came fast or they came silent. This was neither. This was the approach of someone who expected to find a specific person in a specific place and did not see any reason to be cautious about their own arrival. The figure that appeared in the tunnel opening was old. 70, perhaps more, with white hair, thinned enough that the scalp showed through in the emergency lighting, a face deeply lined in the way of someone who has spent decades making difficult decisions in difficult rooms and has carried the weight of those decisions outwardly and visibly over time. He wore civilian clothes, a heavy flannel shirt and canvas work pants and boots that had seen genuine use over many seasons, and he carried nothing in his hands except a small LED lantern held low at his side, with its beam pointed at the floor in front of him. He saw Cade immediately and without surprise. He did not startle or hesitate. He raised both hands to shoulder height, the lantern hanging from the right hand, and held them there with the patience of someone who had thought through this moment in advance and knew what posture it required. Rex walked to him, not ran. Walked with the confident ease of a dog approaching someone familiar, and sat at the old man's feet and looked up at him with an expression that Cade had, until this morning, believed Rex reserved exclusively for him. The expression of an animal in the presence of someone whose presence it found satisfactory. The old man looked down at Rex, and something moved through his face that was not performance. It was genuine, the specific expression of someone seeing an animal they had known in a context that mattered to them, and it carried the particular quality of being partly grief, because the knowing had been one kind of thing, and this seeing was a different kind of thing, and the distance between them was the distance of years and changed circumstances. He looked up at Cade. "Harlan Briggs," he said. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent a long career speaking carefully, measuring words before using them, carrying information without embellishment or evasion. "I built this place. I also helped shut it down. I understand if neither of those things is sufficient reason to trust me at this particular moment." Cade looked at Rex. Rex remained sitting at the old man's feet, unconcerned, present in the specific way the dog was present when his assessment of a situation had concluded in the affirmative. Cade had learned over 6 years to trust that assessment as a data point, not as a definitive conclusion, but as meaningful input that weighed against the decision to treat the old man as a threat requiring immediate response. He did not move away from the wall, but he moved his hand away from the folding knife clipped to his pack strap. "How long has he known you?" Cade said. "From the beginning," Briggs said. "I was present for his training, all 14 months of it. The first 4 months at this facility, the remaining 10 at our primary installation in a different state." Cade absorbed this. The number 14 months was in the documents on the workstation behind him. The old man had produced it without reaching for it or calculating it in the way you produce a number that is simply part of your permanent knowledge, rather than something you retrieve from storage. "Come inside," Cade said. "Hands where I can see them." Briggs walked into the chamber, and Cade watched the way he moved. Slightly stiff in the right knee, compensating in the familiar way of someone who has been negotiating a persistent joint complaint long enough that the compensation has become incorporated into their normal gait. He lowered his hands when Cade indicated it was acceptable to do so, and stood in the center of the room and looked around at the shelves and the workstation and the folder still lying open where Cade had set it down. "You found the primary file," Briggs said. "I found a file with my name on it in a room I had no reason to know existed," Cade said. "I'd say that's a reasonable starting point for a conversation." "It is," Briggs said. Cade gestured toward the workstation chair. Briggs sat in it with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints required that level of attention. Cade remained standing, positioned where he had both the main entrance and the tunnel in his peripheral vision simultaneously. "Start at the beginning," Cade said. "The project's beginning, not yours." Briggs folded his hands on the workstation surface and looked at them for a moment, the brief internal pause of someone organizing information into the order it needs to be presented in, rather than the order it exists in memory. "The program began in 2008, he said. "I was the principal investigator." The research question was, as research questions go, relatively straightforward in its framing, if not in its implications. Why do some individuals exposed to severe and sustained operational trauma recover full psychological function when the statistical majority do not? Not partial recovery. Full recovery, sometimes to better than baseline function, sustained over years of continued exposure to conditions that would incapacitate others. It is a genuine phenomenon. It is documented across every theater and every era of military conflict in the historical record. We wanted to understand it. He looked up at Cade. "You are one of the clearest examples of it I have encountered in 30 years of this work," he said. "Your longitudinal data is exceptional by the metrics we use to define exceptional." Cade did not respond to this. He filed it and stayed with the structural facts. "The surveillance," he said. Briggs nodded. "Identification required longitudinal observation beginning before the exposure we were measuring a recovery from. We needed to find these individuals early before service, because the baseline data we needed was only useful if it preceded the events we were interested in. We worked with selective service records, with educational psychological assessment data, with medical databases. The screening process identified 140 individuals initially. 12 were selected for extended direct observation." He paused. "You watched 19-year-olds, Cade said, without telling them, without giving them the option to refuse." "Yes," Briggs said. He did not qualify it or attempt to reframe it. He said it and left it in the air between them, without reaching to move it or explain it away, which Cade recognized as the response of a man who had done his own full accounting with this specific fact at some point and arrived at a conclusion that he was not going to pretend he had not arrived at. "How long before I knew?" Cade said. "You still don't know," Briggs said. "In the sense the project intended when it designed the observation protocol. You were not meant to know. The validity of the longitudinal behavioral data depended on subjects remaining unaware that they were being observed. You have been under program observation for 15 years, and this morning is the first time you have had any indication of it." Cade thought about the photograph of himself at 19 outside the grain elevator in Wyoming. He thought about what it meant for someone to have been physically present in that moment, close enough to produce that photograph, and in hundreds of subsequent moments without him ever having any awareness of it. He thought about all the mornings he had believed he was alone and had not been. He thought about what else he had not known. "Rex," he said. Briggs was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of reluctance, the quiet of someone measuring the full weight of what they were about to put down before they put it down. "K9-07 was the most significant operational development the project produced, he said. The foundation of the pairing protocol was this: for individuals with your resilience profile, the data consistently showed that the primary vulnerability was not the trauma itself. Your profile processes trauma. It is what your psychology does, and it does it at a level of efficiency that I have rarely observed in 30 years of this work. The primary vulnerability was isolation. When subjects with your profile returned from operational environments and lost the structured relational context of their unit, that was consistently where the metrics showed the sharpest decline, not from the operational experience itself, from the silence that followed it. Cade stood very still. We designed Rex for that silence, Briggs said, not for the mission, for what came after the mission ended. The training protocol was calibrated not to the general tactical profile of a high-performance operator, but to the specific relational profile of one particular man. The specific ways you communicate discomfort without vocalizing it. The specific ways you respond to presence at different proximities. The specific behavioral cues that indicate when you are approaching a threshold. Rex was trained to read all of those things and to respond to them in ways that your psychology would receive as genuine. He paused. And was it, Cade said, genuine? Briggs looked at Rex, who had relocated during the conversation to a position between the two men on the concrete floor, his head resting on his paws, his amber eyes moving between them with the unhurried attention of an animal that has decided the situation is under adequate management and is content to wait for the next development. What Rex has become, Briggs said, is not what we made him. We made him capable of the connection. We built the tools for it, the specific capacity. What he did with those tools across 6 years of living alongside you in the context that actually matter, the mornings and the nights and the difficult stretches and the ordinary ones, that is not something we designed or predicted or could have. The engineering creates the capacity. It cannot create what grows from the capacity when the capacity is given time and experience and the daily accumulation of shared life. Cade let that sit in the air for a moment without responding to it. He moved back to the workstation and picked up the folder and turned to the section he had not yet read, the later documents with the less degraded paper. He found the memo series and read them in sequence, adding each element to the shape forming in his understanding, and when he had finished, he looked up at Briggs. "Colonel Ashby," he said. Something specific moved in Briggs's expression. A small compression around the eyes, the controlled version of a response that would have been more visible without the control. He was the program's primary advocate within the defense establishment, Briggs said. When the Internal Ethics Review Panel recommended closure in 2019, I agreed with their findings and signed the closure documentation. Ashby did not agree with either the findings or the closure. What does Ashby want? Cade said. What he has always wanted, Briggs said. The operational application rather than the research. Ashby's interest in Project Warden was never the science of it. It was what he intended to do with the science. Individuals with your resilience profile paired with purpose-built K9 units trained to specific individual profiles operating in sustained high-stress environments without the psychological attrition that limits the operational window of ordinary operators. He wants to scale it, make it reproducible at volume. The 12 subjects were his proof of concept for that scaling. Is he looking for me specifically? Cade said. Briggs looked at him directly. He found you 2 years ago, Briggs said. The same method I used to find you. Your behavioral signature in the longitudinal data is distinctive enough that a sufficiently motivated analyst can track it forward through publicly available records without direct surveillance. Ashby has analytical resources I do not. He located you before I did, and he has had personnel monitoring this area and this property since then. 2 years. Cade looked at the notation on the final page of his file again. 2 years old. 2 years of someone watching this cabin, watching these trails, watching the rock face. He had walked past 100 times, believing he was walking through his own private morning on his own private land. Rex came to his feet and walked to Cade and sat beside him. Cade did not reach for the dog. He was thinking, and his hands stayed still at his sides. There was a secondary room, Cade said. He had registered the panel in the far wall during his initial sweep of the chamber, noted the dust lines around it that indicated recent displacement, and filed it for investigation after the folder. I'll show you, Briggs said. They crossed the chamber together, and Briggs moved the shelving units aside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular task many times, and behind them was a smaller door with a simple lever handle. The room beyond was small and functional and clearly occupied. A cot with a sleeping bag properly rolled at one end. A camp stove on a metal shelf with a propane cylinder secured beside it. 3 cases of shelf-stable food with expiration dates that were current. A water filtration unit running quietly and effectively in the corner. A folding table with a shortwave radio set up, and a bank of monitoring equipment that Cade recognized as the kind used for passive electronic surveillance of specific radio frequency ranges. Someone had been living here intermittently and with the competence of someone who knew how to sustain themselves in a confined space over extended periods. How long, Cade said. On and off for 3 years, Briggs said. When I understood the full scope of what Ashby was planning, I understood that formally closing the program was not a sufficient response. The data existed in systems I did not control. The subjects existed, and their locations could be determined by someone with sufficient motivation and resources. Neither of those facts could be undone. What I could do was position myself to be present when Ashby moved, so that if he moved into something he had not anticipated. You have been in this room, Cade said, for 3 years intermittently, while I walked past that door every morning on my way to the ridge. Yes. And what were you specifically waiting for? Briggs looked at him steadily. I was waiting for Rex to bring you here, he said. He knows this facility from his training. 4 months of it took place in this location. I believe that given enough years walking this terrain, the chemical signature of the construction sealant would eventually register for him at a proximity that produced a response. It is a distinctive compound. It persists in stone environments for decades. Cade looked at Rex. Rex was in the doorway of the small room present for what was happening without being concerned about how long it would take. You trained him, Cade said, and then you placed him with me. Yes. And you considered that acceptable. I considered it necessary, Briggs said. I am aware the distinction may not carry weight with you. I also believed it was the best disposition I could make of what the program had produced. Rex was going to exist regardless of any decision I made. Ashby would have placed him with someone. I placed him with you. Cade turned to the monitoring equipment on the folding table. The frequency display showed active monitoring on encrypted military communication channels, the kind used by personnel operating domestically under limited exposure protocols. Someone in this area is using secure military communications, he said. Ashby has had 2 individuals maintaining periodic presence in the surrounding terrain for several months, Briggs said. Their activity level increased significantly in the past 2 weeks. Something shifted in their operational posture, and I have not been able to determine what triggered it. Cade picked up the Project Warden folder from where he had carried it and opened it to the final document, the tracker, he said. Passive locator embedded in the folder binding. Standard recovery asset. When I opened the folder, it activated and transmitted a signal. Ashby's monitoring asset now knows the folder has been accessed, and by implication that this facility has been entered. Briggs's expression confirmed it without requiring words. He had known about the tracker. He had known Cade would find the folder. He had designed the sequence of this morning around the understanding that finding the folder would produce the specific operational response from Ashby's side. How long before that signal reaches a relay with line of sight capacity, Cade said. The rock formation limits signal range significantly, Briggs said. 6 hours, perhaps 8 before the activation data can be forwarded. Cade set the folder on the folding table and looked at the satellite communicator in the hard-sided case Briggs had retrieved from under the cot. It was a compact unit with DoD encryption architecture, the same basic interface he had worked with in his operational years, updated in form, but consistent in its underlying structure. He thought about the oversight channels he had learned to navigate in those years, not the program-specific channels that ran through command structures that could be intercepted or delayed or redirected by someone with Ashby's level of institutional access. The legacy channels, the ones that predated the program structures Ashby operated within, the ones that recorded everything automatically and routed to multiple destinations simultaneously in a way that could not be recalled or modified after transmission. He had used one of them once during his service. He had used it because the ordinary structure of authority had declined to address something that needed addressing, and the channel existed for exactly that situation. The report had been received. The situation had been addressed. He had not spoken about it since because the nature of those channels was that you used them when you needed them and did not discuss them in contexts where discussing them would undermine their utility. He looked at Briggs. Your credentials for that unit, he said. Briggs entered the authentication sequence from memory, his hands steady on the keypad, with the steadiness of someone for whom these numbers had long since become automatic. The connection established slowly the limited sky exposure through the antenna configuration Briggs had run to the surface above being the constraint on signal strength. The meter climbed to 3 bars and held there. Cade began to speak. He had filed reports in conditions that did not favor either clarity or time, and he had learned to compress essential information to the specific density that specific channels required. He gave his name and service number, still remembered, because certain numbers become structural once you have repeated them often enough in contexts where they mattered. He gave the facility coordinates from the mapping documentation in the Project Warden files. He gave the project designation and the DoD program identifier from the ethics board correspondence Briggs had shown him. He described the surveillance conducted against him without his knowledge or consent across 15 years, the duration of it, the evidence available to document it. He described the unauthorized continuation of program activity following the official closure in 2019. He described what appeared to be Ashby's operational personnel currently present on private property in Gallatin County, Montana. He stated that the complete evidentiary record was in his possession and would be delivered to the appropriate oversight authority within 24 hours. He stated that this transmission was being made for the purpose of establishing a permanent record that could not be subsequently modified. He requested acknowledgement of receipt. He held the unit and waited. The response came in 90 seconds. A tone sequence and then text on the small display. Receipt confirmed, record created, routing initiated. The channel was a legacy oversight line that predated the program structures Colonel Ashby operated within, the kind of line that routed automatically to multiple destinations and whose routing could not be recalled after initiation. Cade set the unit down. He looked at Briggs, who had listened to the entire transmission without speaking. The channel records everything automatically and routes to multiple destinations simultaneously, Cade said. What I transmitted is now in a system that Ashby does not control and cannot reach. It cannot be recalled. It cannot be deleted. The record exists. Briggs was looking at him with an expression Cade had not seen on the old man's face in the time they had been together in this room. Something that occupied the territory between relief and recognition without being precisely either. You knew that channel, Briggs said. I used it once before, Cade said, when the ordinary route wasn't functioning. He picked up the hard-sided case with Briggs's documentation and closed it securely and set it beside the satellite communicator. 2 records now. One in a network Ashby could not reach. One in this room that needed to leave this room. Rex had not relaxed from his alert posture during the transmission. The dog's nose was still working, processing ongoing information from the direction of the tunnel, tracking a situation that was continuing to develop rather than a single fixed point. Cade looked at Rex. Rex turned and looked at him with the expression that had a specific meaning across 6 years of shared experience. 3, Cade said quietly. He looked at Briggs. You're walking with me, he said. Directly behind. Rex leads when we reach the entrance. Briggs nodded without hesitation. They moved through the main chamber past the workstation where the Project Warden folder lay open past the shelving units and the crates and the years of accumulated classified material and into the tunnel. The emergency panels cast their dim green along the corridor as they moved through it for what Cade understood would be the last time this space served the purpose it had been built for. Rex moved ahead, nose working the air continuously, body carrying none of the tension that preceded approach to genuine threat. He was moving toward something he had already assessed and found within the range of manageable. The cold October air came through from the forest when they reached the tunnel entrance, clean and sharp after the stale underground air. And Rex stepped through first, and Cade followed and Briggs behind him, and they stood at the base of the rock face in the morning light and looked across 100 yards of open forest to the tree line. 3 men stood at its edge. Civilian clothes, but the configuration they held was not civilian. The spacing between them, the positioning relative to the rock face, the way they had closed the most direct departure route while maintaining their own line back to the trail. One held a radio at his side. All 3 were looking at the door that had just opened from the inside. The man in the center was Colonel Ashby. Cade recognized him from the Project Warden file photographs taken during program review meetings a decade earlier. He was in his 60s now, with the specific military lean that age did not take from some men, his hair gray and cropped, close his bearing. The bearing of a man who had spent 40 years occupying positions of authority and had come to experience authority as a natural condition rather than something conferred. He looked at Cade, he looked at Briggs, he looked at the hard-sided case in Cade's hand. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who is in the middle of a calculation and is waiting for the calculation to complete before he decides what to do. Cade spoke first. He said what needed to be said with the same economy he had used in the transmission 40 minutes ago. The oversight channel. The record that now existed in a system Ashby did not control and could not reach. The routing to multiple destinations, automatic, complete, irreversible. The evidentiary case that would reach the referenced oversight authority within 24 hours, regardless of anything that happened between now and then. The record exists, Cade said. It cannot be unmade. Ashby stood very still through all of this. He was the kind of man who had learned that deliberate stillness communicated authority, and he deployed it now with the precision of long practice, the calculated stillness of someone who is thinking carefully and wants you to be aware that he is thinking carefully. Cade waited. The man on Ashby's left shifted his weight. The one on his right glanced at Ashby. These were not men making independent assessments of a situation. They were men waiting for direction from someone else, which meant the resolution of the situation lived entirely with the man standing in the center. Ashby looked at Briggs. 3 years, Ashby said. You held all of this back for 3 years. Briggs said nothing. Ashby's jaw tightened once and released. A small movement barely visible from this distance. The physical expression of a calculation, arriving at a conclusion that the calculator finds unacceptable. Cade had watched men arrive at this specific conclusion before in different settings, with different stakes, and he knew what followed in the ones who had sufficient experience to recognize when a situation had moved definitively past the point where force remained a useful option. Ashby looked at the case in Cade's hand one final time. Then he turned and walked back into the tree line. The two men with him followed without words. The forest received them the way forests receive people who know how to move in them, and within 30 seconds there was nothing at the edge of the tree line except trees and the pale October light coming through them in the long diagonal shafts of late morning. Rex sat down. Cade stood with the case in his hand and watched the tree line for 2 full minutes. The branches moved in the small wind that had developed while they were underground. Nothing else moved at the tree line. He exhaled. Briggs came to stand beside him. "What happens to him now?" Briggs said. "The record routes to the Inspector General's office and to the Congressional Oversight channels that are part of the legacy system's automatic routing," Cade said. "Once they receive it, they are obligated by process to respond. That is built into the structure of those channels." He paused. "Ashby knows that. That's why he left without an argument. He'll have lawyers," Briggs said. "And I'll have this," Cade said. He held the case up briefly. "Every document in here becomes part of the formal complaint record when I deliver it. The surveillance files, the ethics board correspondence, the pairing protocol documentation, the unauthorized continuation after closure, all of it." He lowered the case. "You should have done this 3 years ago," he said. "I know," Briggs said. "Why didn't you?" Briggs looked out at the tree line where Ashby had gone. "Because using the record required a subject with standing," he said. "Someone who had been surveilled without consent and was willing to come forward and provide standing for a formal complaint. Without a subject, I had a whistleblower's file and no standing. With a subject, I had a case." He paused. "And because I wasn't certain the right subject when he came would choose to use it rather than choose to walk away from it." Cade looked at him. "What made you think I would?" Briggs looked at Rex. 15 years of data," he said. "And 6 years of watching what you did with what we gave you when we gave it to you." He paused. "There is a quality that appears consistently in the long-term behavioral record of individuals with your profile. It is not aggression, though that is present. It is not endurance, though that is present also. It is the specific unwillingness to allow something demonstrably wrong to remain unaddressed when addressing it falls within your capacity to do." He looked at Cade directly. "I built 3 years of waiting on that quality," he said. "I was betting everything I had on it." Cade did not respond to that. He turned and looked at the rock face behind him, at the open steel door in the gray granite, at the morning light that had now reached its lower edge and was finding the rust on the old hinges and making it briefly something other than rust. He thought about how many times he had walked past this formation, how many times Rex had walked past it, knowing what was behind it, waiting for the particular morning when showing Cade would be the right thing to do. He looked at Rex. Rex was watching him with the patient attention he brought to these mornings, the attention that had no agenda beyond presence and the expectation of whatever came next being acceptable to him because he was with Cade, and that was the primary condition he required. 9 years old, still moving with that ease, still bringing that quality of attention to every morning as though every morning were worth the full measure of his attention, which was the thing about Rex that Cade had never been able to fully explain to anyone and had stopped trying to explain. The connection had been engineered. The engineering had produced something that no one had engineered. You can engineer the capacity. You cannot engineer what grows from it. Cade crouched to Rex's level. The dog turned to look at him directly. In the October morning light, the amber of Rex's eyes had the specific quality that Cade had stopped consciously noticing sometime in the second year, because you stopped consciously noticing the specific qualities of things you look at every single day. And he was noticing it now, the quality of attention behind those eyes, present and specific and entirely without agenda. It would have happened anyway, Cade said. He was speaking in the quiet way he spoke to Rex on mornings when there was no one else and nothing that needed to be managed or controlled, speaking to clarify something for himself as much as for the animal in front of him. Whatever they built you to do, what you actually did was different from what they built you to do. What you actually did was stay every morning, every night, for 6 years. That wasn't in any protocol document. Rex put his paw on Cade's knee. It was not a trained behavior. It was not documented in any project file or pairing specification or training log. It was the gesture of one living creature choosing in this specific moment to make physical contact with another living creature because that was what the moment called for. And because making that contact was what this particular animal had consistently chosen to do across 6 years of ordinary mornings and difficult nights, and the full accumulated weight of shared experience that no program had designed and no document had recorded, because it could not be designed or recorded, only lived. Cade put his hand over the paw. They stayed like that for a moment at the base of the rock face in the October morning, the forest quiet around them, the trail visible through the trees 100 yards away, the day continuing around them with the indifference of days. Then Cade stood. He looked at Briggs. "I need your formal cooperation with the oversight investigation," he said. "Your testimony and your documentation submitted in the proper form." "You have it," Briggs said, "without qualification. You'll need somewhere to stay while this moves through the oversight process," Cade said. "The cabin is small, 1 bedroom and a main room." Something moved through the old man's tired eyes. Something in the territory adjacent to gratitude occupying that territory without being precisely that. "I've been sleeping in a concrete room on a camping cot for 3 years," Briggs said. "I'll manage." Cade looked at the open door one final time. The green emergency light was still faintly visible at the far end of the tunnel, the last useful power that had persisted through all the years of the mountain sitting above it, sufficient, apparently, for this one final passage through this space. He reached over and pulled the steel door closed. The mechanism engaged with the same sound it had made when he opened it 2 hours ago, metal returning to metal, the seal reestablishing the rock face, closing back into its outward appearance of simply being rock. He picked up the case. He looked at Rex. Rex was already moving toward the trail, not looking back, not pausing to confirm that Cade would follow, simply moving in the direction of what came next, the way he had always moved on these mornings, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing where you are going and knowing that the person behind you will follow, because they always have. Cade followed. The 3 of them walked out of the trees and onto the trail, the October morning fully established now, the frost that had been on the ground when they started 2 hours ago, burned off by the climbing sun, the trail running in both directions through the ponderosa pines in the particular morning light that made this place what it was. Rex turned south toward the cabin without being directed, because Rex knew where home was. Cade walked and thought about the record that now existed in the places it needed to exist, the record that would move through the processes. It would move through at the speed that institutional processes moved, which was not fast, but was irreversible. He thought about Ashby somewhere in this forest or on the road away from it, making calculations that were different from the ones he had arrived with this morning. He thought about a 19-year-old standing in summer heat in Wyoming, having no idea that the shape of his life was already being observed and measured and planned around that the dog he would be paired with 8 years later was already in the earliest phase of being trained to fit him specifically. He thought about what it meant that all of that had happened, and he was still here on this trail in this morning with this dog 3 feet ahead of him, moving with the easy, purposeful gait of an animal that has made its choices in lives in them without reservation. Rex slowed and looked back at him, the patient look that meant he had outpaced Cade and was waiting for him to close the distance. Cade lengthened his stride and closed it. Rex turned forward, and they were moving together at the pace they always moved on these mornings, and the trail ran south toward the cabin in the good morning light. The mountain held what it had always held more than Cade had known until this morning. The record existed in the places it needed to exist, and would do what it needed to do through processes that did not require his management of them. The case was in his hand and would go where it needed to go before the day was over. And Rex was 3 feet ahead of him on a trail they had walked together 1,000 mornings and would walk together on the mornings that came after this one. That was the thing that had always been true. That was the thing that would remain true. And Cade understood walking in the October morning light behind the animal that had been built to know him and had spent 6 years choosing him anyway, every morning, every night, through everything, that there was a difference between a thing that is made and a thing that is real, and that the difference was not in the origin but in the time that followed it. Time and showing up. Every morning, every night, the accumulated and uncountable weight of all of it together, which was the only thing that made anything real, and the only thing that could not be engineered or designed or planned for in advance. Rex moved along the trail with the unhurried, purposeful gait of an animal that has made a choice about how to live and lives in that choice completely. 9 years old, still choosing. Briggs walked behind them both, an old man at the end of a long patience, and the trail carried all 3 of them south through the ponderosa pines toward a cabin at the edge of the trees where a day was beginning that would require a great deal of them, and that they would meet all 3 of them, because meeting what the day required was what you did, and because some things once begun continued regardless of what you had expected when you started them. Rex reached the point where the trail emerged from the trees, and the cabin was visible ahead, small and solid against the morning sky, its windows catching the light in the way windows caught light when the angle was right and the glass was clean. He stopped and looked back at Cade one final time with the amber eyes and the particular expression that had no name in any language, but that Cade had learned across 6 years to read correctly. It meant, "We're here. Whatever comes next, we're here." Cade looked back at him with the only response that expression ever required. He kept walking.